Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for the invite to speak at this. Yes, my name is Marianna Masters. I was elected councillor of Lambeth in 2018. I've been chair of the Lambeth Labour group of councillors, and it's quite a large group, so 57 councillors. And I also am newly now elected vice chair of our Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I sit on a committee that looks at sort of health outcomes for 6 London boroughs. And I have an interest in Black mental health outcomes, and so I'm on the partnership board of a Lambeth charity called Black Thrive. I was interested in speaking on this topic. I think it's, on the face of it, you might think, oh my gosh, you're trying to shoehorn into every sort of talk and subject possible. But I actually do see a real warning sign as to what could potentially happen with sleepwalking into a hard Brexit. I should start by way of a quick backstory. I'm born and bred in Lambeth, born in 1969, so I'm an old bird. Grew up in the 70s and 80s with mass unemployment, lots of social problems in Lambeth, which although have been to a large extent addressed in that we have a really diverse, young, vibrant borough, there are still pockets of real deprivation, and in fact, far from being the centre of the metropolitan elite, it is the 8th worst borough in terms of deprivation. We have 31% of our population living in really compromised situation in terms of poverty. So in terms of the whole Brexit debate, now I'm one of the people that you would probably point to and say, as a Black woman, I have been able to navigate a career in different sectors, mainly in the corporate world, and have achieved a sort of modicum of success. But actually, through that whole journey, you could write, say, the positive side, or you could actually talk it real, be real. And the reality of being Black and British and navigating our society is a constant struggle. So there are underlying structural problems, racism, that affect every whether you are at whether you're at sort of in the corporate world, and realizing that you are banging your head against a glass ceiling and your career progression is going nowhere, whether you're trying to access the actual jobs market, whether you're trying to access the right level of education, housing, the fact that we are more disproportionately affected by a criminal justice system whereby we're more likely to be put in prison, many more times likely to be sectioned and not given adequate mental health provision. All of this has come at a time now where we've had the worst pandemic in our lifetime, and that again reinforces the fact that we disproportionately are affected by something that's seemingly out of our control. And that then, together with George Floyd's really just awful murder, which isn't anything new really, because we've seen this kind of thing happen time and time again. There are incidents through our history where Black people have been lynched, have been killed, we've had race riots. I grew up in the 80s where there were riots, and we've seen well-charted incidents of police brutality. This seems like a different time where actually people are actually making connections with structural inequalities, and actually saying we need to address what's happening with our Black community. And so I feel that as someone who has been elected, I have a platform to make sure that people are aware that it's not just a case of sucking it up and trying to navigate your way forward. I would say that our fight at times feels like you're out of an Olympic stadium, and even if you had Usain Bolt running for you, you would never catch up and win the race because you're so far behind the starting line. And so a hard Brexit, which is something that I think that there are nefarious forces at play that are actually helping us to sleepwalk into the worst case scenario for us, where we actually think, without even the pandemic, that the GDP was going to sort of have a huge knock, let alone now with COVID. I really feel that it's all of our duties, not just people of colour, to actually really look into communities that are marginalised, because the situation, we won't be talking about a recession, we'll be talking about depression, and it's not really, all the Project Fear labels that I had thrust upon me for being a Brexit bore when I tried and went on marches and tried to campaign for a people's vote, I think are like the worst, the best case reality, because I think the situation will be really worse, and especially worse for people of colour. So in terms of sort of ending on a positive note, I think that as people who are, as Labour supporters, as Labour members, as people who want a sort of a socialist future, I would argue that we should keep on lobbying our leadership, which, actually wants to reset our society, we feel, in, the best, the fairest way, to actually acknowledge that, this is not just a moment. This isn't just a media hype that will die away until the next issue. There are structural inequalities that get highlighted and then bubble up. And this is like a game of whack-a-mole. You feel that you might have it under control in terms of social justice and less say riots, but then you watch rising unemployment, you watch people not being able to access housing, and all of these problems are disproportionately affecting the Black community. So mine is a call to action. Mine is a call that the Labour leadership take note and actually create a position in terms of a shadow minister position to look at outcomes for Black, Asian, minority, ethnic people. And I hate the acronym, but actually, there is strength in solidarity. So I appreciate that you can look at minority groups and look at sort of positive interventions. I'm very proud to be from Lambeth, as you can see from my background, where we have different initiatives, whether it's initiatives on better outcomes for mental health, Black people accessing mental health, or whether it's trying to stop the sort of pathway to prison for young kids who have been suspended, are likely to be expelled. And we've had positive intervention programs like Raising the Game, where we've reduced the level of expulsions from, say, 15% to 4% in the space of 2 years, because we've identified that there's a problem. We've gathered data. We've had somebody solely looking into positive outcomes, and it's not enough to have Black outcomes shoehorned into different departments. I think the time has come to actually say, if we're serious, we should put resources behind this and manpower behind this. So I think I'll leave it there for now. I'm happy to take questions
later.
Great.
Thanks, Marianna. We'll come back to your questions in a little while. That was really great and fascinating for everybody, I'm sure. Certainly was for me. Kaz, can we come to you next, please? That would be great, and then we'll get through the Bashir and Val and Mete after that.
Yeah. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, crack on.
Right. So thanks for inviting me, everyone. My name's Kasun Witana. I'm a supporter of Labour for a Socialist Europe, an NHS worker in Sheffield, and also political education officer for Penistone and Stockbridge CLP. So we don't know to what extent the Black Lives Matter protests will continue, but I think for sure Labour and union activists need to a far greater extent need to join them and engage with the mainly young people taking a part. We need real debate in our party and unions about what policies are needed to live up to our responsibilities at this juncture. I think it's fine to express general sympathy, but what should we campaign for, and how would a Labour government make a difference? I think the drive behind the protests comes, as a previous speaker has said, not only from the outrage at the murder of George Floyd and similar incidents here, but a much wider landscape of racism and inequality which needs radical change to even start to address. So the recent Public Health England report on COVID-19 and ethnic minorities summarises how the pandemic has battered Black and brown people due to pre-existing and deepening inequalities in UK society. The report advocates large-scale and transformative change to structural and societal environments such as homes, neighbourhoods and workplaces. However, some of its recommendations, I think, fall far short. So I think really what I'd like to talk about is what I think the Labour movement should be demanding. And as I've not got long, I just thought a few ideas really. So the first thing about Brexit, the current deadline for extending the transition, you know, it's passing, and Labour has so far been silent, but a disastrous double whammy of a no deal or hard Brexit in the midst of a COVID-19 fallout will be a triple whammy for many BAME people, for the NHS and particularly BAME NHS workers. I think we need to break the silence, speak out about what the Tories' plans will mean, and start a serious discussion about how we can block them. I think we should fight unambiguously for migrants' rights and free movement. Labour should campaign for the entire pro-migrant policy passed at last year's conference. I think we should be shouting loud to abolish no recourse to public funds and the NHS surcharge, which will benefit many BAME people and make everyone safer if we stop that. So secondly, what do we say about the immediate issues raised by the protests? I think we need to change the entrenched position that more police is an answer to society's problems. We need to develop clear demands to curb their powers to harass BAME, poor and young people, and to make them more accountable to democratic scrutiny and control. I think we should demand a dramatic reduction of the prison population, and then to damaging policies like criminalisation of drugs, which themselves feed the prison system. But I think more broadly, we need to reshape not just criminal justice, but the whole of society. For me, genuine democratic community policing can only exist in a society of democratic community economics, socialism. But at present, society is moving fast in the wrong direction. Labour's not campaigning for even the most obvious and basic demands to help the working class, in particular BAME workers, defend ourselves. So why aren't we calling for a publicly run track and trace system? Why aren't we campaigning to stop a new wave of council cuts and restore the desperately needed funding councils have lost? Why aren't we campaigning for all workers to be able to isolate on full pay and radically better sick pay? Why aren't we demanding public ownership of social care? And I think, you know, those just a few things to start. We need a comprehensive programme for rebuilding and expanding our public sector, our youth services, our mental health services, our refuges, and providing jobs, homes and support people will need in the coming crisis. So that means a major assertion of public ownership. Demands like this are also in the existing conditions, anti-racism. There's a lot more, of course, I could go on, for instance, about the school curriculum, but I think I'm approaching the end. I think the last thing I'll say is that we should free our trade unions from anti-union laws. And by that I mean all anti-union laws, so we can defend ourselves and fight for change. I think Labour needs to reorient, radicalise our policies and actually start campaigning. That of course means ending the lockdown on party democracy and asserting members' rights to start discussing, taking decisions and deciding a way forward. And I think as part of that, we need a vibrant democratic BAME sections in the party. So I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kaz. That was great and really, really clear and practical as well, which I appreciate. Val, can we come to you next, please?
Thank you. Well done, previous speakers. Going to just kick off as with an article, actually. September the 5th, 2019, Dr. Subada Haq, hopefully I've pronounced it correctly, from the Runnymede Trust, he spoke about the no-deal Brexit dilemma was going to be bad news for the 8 million Black and minority ethnic people in the UK. Now, as a community campaigner and a political activist, I didn't see any 8 million people on the demonstrations that I was on and that I helped to lead, and that I, locally tried to galvanize that momentum to go forward. My thing has always been about representation, and I've been lucky enough to read most of the reports. It's very tiring on the eyes. I'm still a Remainer, not a Ramona. But for me, it's about the whole thing of like trying to have representation in the Labour Party, and I just think that we didn't have that, and that's something we can kind of reflect on going forward. I do believe another Europe is possible with us in it, staying closely aligned with them. I just felt that in reflection in 2016, that the campaign literature didn't kind of see us within it. It's great that we have the umbrella of Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, as a sort of, movement going forward in a section, but often Black people are often quite invisible. And I think that can be something that can be stemmed off to say that it's an anti-Black sentiment. I think sometimes we're scared to talk about racism and how it impacts on all of our communities. I always tell people my stories and about how I'm proud to work in a Jewish school. And they're the first of many that are not actually just saying they're going to be anti, racist campaigners, but they're going to have like a student-led body that will look into how BME communities, Black, Asian, minority, ethnic people feel about when they're in different white spaces, I call it. Those that have often privilege, white privilege. But to bring it back down to the representation aspect, I just found that when we were campaigning, there wasn't many of us that felt aligned to the argument of why we would remain as Black people or as African, Caribbean diasporans. It was very much a sort of white middle class campaign that, we saw the horrid, what can I call it, the Brexit party, the UKIP party, that obviously had the vans that had the sort of the go home vans on it that many of us could kind of relate, and it became quite hostile for us to knock on the doors. I went places like Wakefield, I was in Bolton, Middlesbrough, and I solely went there because I wanted to be representative at the door. So I tried to engage with people that were on the list that I could relate to, and I could speak to them about the notion and the importance of, if we remained, how important it would be for our communities. And I think many people just still are oblivious to understanding that Black people have moved around, freedom of movement, which Kaz, you spoke about, which I still think Labour has been very quiet on. And many industries will suffer if we don't have Black people coming from various places like Africa or the Caribbean continent, and also the Asian community as well. And often we don't big up migrants and refugees, and we're always seen to be just dumped on, and there's a negative kind of rhetoric that goes on about us taking people's homes and their jobs. And from what I can understand is, if when we even come over here, because my parents were migrants, that they worked in the lowest paid jobs and were always overqualified. And that brings it back to the likes of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter campaign. I wish they had been there when 2016 was happening and I was on the demonstrations, but they weren't there. And now that they're here now, it's really important, because I think it's like Marianna said, it's not a moment, it's a movement. And it's about having that kind of cross-party kind of, solidarity, that we can do so much if we work together collaboratively. And we need to kind of like think how, as the Black community, so when I say Black, politically Black, so how Black, Asian, minority, ethnic people can kind of campaign on things that they really believe in, and that they can have a voice, because often people speak on our behalf and don't actually come to our communities, and they don't often understand what we want and what we need so desperately. And I think many migrants, especially my community in Islington, have gone underground now, I call it, and they are either sofa surfing, or like many in my family who now have their correct status, touch wood. It was a struggle, you know, financially, the burden. It was painful, because even with the Windrush, we always hear about the Caribbean community, but we never hear about the African community and how many of us are still displaced. And again, when we talk about Europe and we talk about, you know, freedom of movement, you know, not just white Europeans live in Europe. Hello, we have Black people there too. I've got families that are like Italian and Portuguese. There's a massive argument at the moment about the Portuguese not being able to have UK citizens come over, and my family are like screaming at the TV, like, what's going on? And I don't know what that is. And could that be an anti-racist sentiment? I think so. Is it an anti-Black, you know, kind of rhetoric? It could be. We know there's a population in Portugal that are Black descent. And back to George Floyd, you know, I'm an internationalist, and when it happened, I was watching on the news, and as a campaigner, I've been terrified to go back out, because being Black, you cannot hide. And there's this phrase that I've been saying now, even to my you know, students I work with, you know, we need to see more Black faces in all places, and especially in white places or faces, because then we can kind of like reiterate what it is it feels like to be on the outside and to often feel invisible. So many policies are being made, and we're never at the table. We are never there at the forefront to campaign and push for things. You know, the whole notion of Black Lives Matter is fantastic, and I applaud them for what they're doing, but they're not the first anti-fascist campaigners to be out there. I've been doing this for the last few years. There's some magnificent campaigns, like, you know, Stand Up to Racism, that have different, you know, national party campaign groups, you know, across, that work with the likes of Labour and other party members. And I think what's important as well is I know that Labour had the Labour Against Racism and Fascism, and that launched, I think, in 2016, if I'm not wrong. And we need to see more of that. You know, sometimes I go to these meetings, and again, I'm pro, you know, for everybody, but I just find sometimes when it's about Black issues, everyone goes really silent, and if not silent, they're actually mute, as in like you can hear a pin drop. And I just want to see more, you know, allies. I want to see this in every industry. And, you know, we should be screaming at, you know, now we're in a pandemic, and it's really sad seeing the reports that have shown that we are disproportionately being impacted, you know, the Black, Asian, minority, ethnic communities. And there's been no safeguarding for any of us. And that's really sad. And the safety net has, you know, across, you know, all parts of, you know, housing, health, education, and it's really sad to see, because I'm raising, you know, a young family, and I work with children and young people, and I can't give them any hope. And the phrase that I kind of want to kind of leave with you is not a sentiment that is going to be light, but it's the sentiment that's going to kind of hopefully have a heavy, I suppose, a woe in your heart, that we have to all just speak up and not shy away when things are happening. And it's the thing of like just that heavy, you know, knee that's been on our neck for so many years. And being Black, as I said, I cannot hide my face. You know, I can change my hairstyles, my rap, and stuff, but I can't hide who I am. I can't, you know, even if I go on radio, they'll hear the hint of, you know, the accent, or the, you know, the dialect, that I'm, you know, African. I'm very proud, Islingtonian, born and bred here. But I just think it's time that we just really start to make a push, and not make this a moment, but make this a movement. Black Lives Matter is really poignant. It's at a time where I think we've all just been fed up, and we need to now stand with them, and, you know, just have all our allies and just keep pushing. And just to end on one thing, so I know I'll probably forget, because I do go on a bit. the reason why I campaign as well and go around with the Labour Party is not because of any left-wing agenda or right. It's about policies. And I think as Black people, Asian, minority ethnics, we have to kind of stop allowing people to kind of box us into these positions where we have so much more in common than what the political arena does to us. We can't have people in the left, in the right, these moderates. We need to come together as a collective and look at the policies that are going to actually impact on our communities, that are going to give us that equity in education, in health, in employment, in the environment, in all the other the spheres that are there. And I think the world will be a better place. And I'll leave it on that. Just get your heavy knees off our neck. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Val. That was great and really helpful. Mete, let's come to you. If you give us a very brief intro as to who you are, and then tell us what you think, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike, for putting this on and for everyone for having me on. So my name is Mete. I have a few different hats on. So I run a charity called My Life, My Say, which aims to engage young people in politics. I've actually worked very closely with Mike over the past few years, because part of the role of my charity was making sure that young people's voices were heard in politics. And we've done a lot of good work together with Mike and sort of making sure that young people were heard in terms of sort of the process of the negotiations. I'm also a Labour councillor in Stoke Newington as well. So very close to Val and to Bashir. So yeah, and obviously, from the better part of London. Sorry, Marianna, I know you got the Lambeth. You're gonna have to excuse me on that one. I should have the Hackney behind me. But I mean, I guess, look, I don't want to sort of like kind of repeat what everyone's already been saying, but I think, the coronavirus sort of pandemic sort of exposed and amplified a lot of inequalities in our society. And, in many ways, I think it's been very difficult for a lot of families and a lot of people. I mean, I see it, Marianna, I'm sure you see it as in your role as a councillor as well. It's really, really difficult. And I count myself very lucky to sort of not be going through some of the problems that people are going through. But I think we need to really make sure that we use this as a moment to change society. And one of my biggest fears is that, we see as lockdown is being eased slowly, you see, it's almost like people have forgotten that we've been living the last few months and they're just sort of jumping back into life very quickly. And I'm very, very worried that we'll be forgetting and not learning from the lessons that we need to. I 100% agree with everything that Val has been saying about, the allyship with the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, I'm someone who sort of grew up in Hackney. It's one of the most diverse boroughs in Europe, if not, in the UK, if not Europe. And, ultimately, I made the decision to go to the first protest when it took place in London. And when I went there, I knew I went there with the Mayor of Hackney, and we both went there knowing that, we probably was going to be criticised because we were breaking the rules around social distance. I mean, albeit we were trying to socially distance at the protest, but it's difficult when you've got hundreds of thousands of people out there. But, ultimately we took the decision that, if we don't stand up for what's right now, whenever we ever going to, what sort of message will we be sending to people in Hackney and all of our friends as well. So we took the sort of decision to go there. And I think, it's great in a way, I think it's great that the attention is where it needs to be. In my role with my charity, I've made sure that we've removed all of the events that we were doing centered around other issues, and because we didn't want to take away young people's attention from the conversation around Black Lives Matter. And I think, my real concern is that, the conversation is getting somewhat sort of, we're sort of getting distracted, I think the statues are very important that we know about, for example, the history of our statues and everything, but I don't think that's the sort of sole purpose of the Black Lives Matter movement. The same thing, around, lots of the other issues that we're seeing over the last couple of sort of weeks and months. And I think, the real concern I have is that, we've had this inspiring sort of movement of, young people from, and just people generally from all sorts of backgrounds. I mean, if anyone went to the protests, you would have seen it. I was listening to Obama and what Obama was saying, And Obama was saying the difference between the movement now and the movement maybe in the 60s and 70s was that, you know, back then it was just black people, and, you know, you were frowned upon for going along to these protests, whereas now when you look at it, you've got all sorts of diverse communities, and it feels very different. And we just need to make sure that we really sort of, you know, kick up our politicians to really make that difference, you know. And I think, Marianna, your suggestion about actually creating a post for specifically looking to address the inequalities that affect black people. And, you know, yes, I think BME people is also important as well, but I think sometimes, and I say this as a BME person as well, you know, as someone who's grown up in Hackney, I think sometimes we have to recognize that, you know, black people are even more disproportionately affected than the wider BME community. And sometimes, you know, you have to allow that space for that work. And, you know, we see that in Hackney, for example. We have the Young Black Men's Project in Hackney, and we got criticised a lot for it when we first set it up, because people were like, what about this community? What about this community? And yes, it's not saying that those communities don't matter, and it's not saying that we shouldn't be doing work around those communities, but what's really important is that we're recognising that this community has had issues ongoing for loads and loads and loads of sort of decades, and it's been centuries really, and, you know, we have to try to sort of address these issues. So I think what I would like to see, what's going to happen over the next few weeks, is really sort of to build on that moment. I think there's been lots of really interesting sort of like young activists popping up, you know, young leaders. Hopefully, you know, they can find a home in the Labour Party and sort of grow within the Labour Party. But it's also worrying. I know part of the conversation today is about Brexit as well, and I think, you know, partly what worries me about everything which is happening with coronavirus and everything else as well is that, you know, everyone is forgetting that, you know, ultimately we may find ourselves in a position where, very likely, where we might leave again the EU with no deal. And I know, you know, we keep coming back to this conversation, but ultimately that's going to affect our communities, like the ethnic minority communities, again, the most. And I think the public is distracted around that conversation. The government seems to be getting away with it, like they are getting away with everything else. And I think, you know, we have to try to find a way in which we can really put pressure on the government to delay the transition period to next year, at least, to give us another year, because, you know, it's impossible for them to be, you know, in the middle of the biggest, you know, crisis that we've ever faced probably in modern history, and at the same time trying to negotiate a deal which takes other countries years to do. And I think, you know, the new leadership has started positive. I mean, I've had the pleasure of working with Keir Starmer over a number of years now through my life. I say he's always had a lot of time for engaging young people's views on Brexit. Myself and him, we also was in touch with Michel Barnier about British youth's views as well. You know, just recently last week, we had a call with over 1,000 young people across the UK where he was listening to their views. I think we've got the right type of leadership where he's listening to the views of people, and he wants to do the right things. But I also feel like, you know, let's be honest, it's not an easy task that he has in hand, not least because of where the party was after the election, but also because, you know, just being realistic about it, you know, we're having to talk through screens right now. So it's not an easy task for him as well. And, you know, I think, you know, it's been positive where you see his poll approval ratings is sort of past Boris Johnson's approval ratings. I think he brings a sense of calm to the debate, and the public are starting to see that. And I think we really got to get behind him and, you know, hopefully bring about that change that the country desperately needs.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mete. That's great and encouraging as always. Right, last but very much not least, we'll come to Bashir, and then after that we will do have some time for Q&A and discussion. If you've got a point you want to raise, you can either use the raise your hand tool in the participants tab, or you can post your question in the chat, and I will keep an eye on both. Okay, Bashir, off you go. Thank you so much for speaking, by the way, and also do introduce yourself, please.
Will do. Thank you very much for that, Mike. And hi, everyone. My name is Bashir Ibrahim, and I was born and raised in Islington, and I was working on the People's Vote campaign as a campaign manager, and with specific focus on ethnic minorities and faith communities. So one of the things that I credit, this was pre-coup of the People's Vote campaign, and one of the things is I just felt like Black and ethnic minority people were left out of the conversation on Brexit. And there's, like Valerie's mentioned, there's 8 million people from ethnic minority communities in the UK. And I think if the Remain campaign, this is a personal view, but if I believe if the Remain campaign had successfully engaged with the ethnic minority community in the UK, then the outcome in 2016 may have been a different one. And the reason I say that is because Boris Johnson and Priti Patel and others from the Leave campaign skillfully and strategically managed to appeal to ethnic minority communities, and they came up with campaigns such as Save the Curry Houses, and encouraging people to vote for Brexit because it will be easier for their relatives from Africa or the Caribbean or Asia to come here. And we didn't have a very good offer for ethnic minority communities. We were just asking people to vote for us because who else are you going to vote for? And I think that's where we failed. And then when you look at some of the research and the academic research, it's about approximately 30% of ethnic minorities who voted in 2016 voted to leave the European Union. And I've, through my time of working on the People's Vote campaign and I launched something called Ethnic Minorities for a People's Vote. And I was working with a range of people. Some of those were sort of policy and other think tanks like Race on the Agenda and the Runnymede Trust, who've done amazing work looking at the impact of Brexit on ethnic minority women. And one thing I want to mention is Nima Begum, who was successfully defending her PhD in the past few weeks at Manchester University, was researching BAME motivations in 2016. So why ethnic minorities voted for Leave or why they voted for Remain. And she found that the motivations for those who voted for Remain were broadly in line with the wider population as a whole and the white population. But one factor that differentiated ethnic minority Remain voters from their white counterparts when they were surveyed was the strength of their reaction when they saw, which they saw as a very xenophobic and anti-immigrant tone of the Leave campaign. So what they did was, and this is why sometimes I feel like analysis is very lazy, a lot of those ethnic minorities who voted to Remain wasn't for an endorsement of the EU, but it was a vote against the Leave campaign and that nasty rhetoric. And I think this leads into a much wider conversation around ambivalence towards the EU in 2016. I know so many people, friends and family, who just did not vote in 2016. And I remember speaking to someone and someone said, I thought the EU referendum was going to be like the AV referendum. I don't know if anyone remembers the 2011, something that Nick Clegg was very passionate about, was having alternative voting. Because referendums, by nature, we just don't do many of them in this country. So when it was, people just thought, I think I was the only one of my friends who actually voted in the AV referendum in 2011. It's just, and so people were not very exercised pro-Europe or anti-Europe. And through my work on the People's Vote campaign, I spoke to a lot of people who maybe had regret or didn't appreciate the full consequences of Brexit or not voting for the European, remain in the European Union. But one of the things I wanted to focus on today, I know I have a few short minutes, was one large group of people that have been left out of the conversation entirely are Black Europeans. And the erasure of Black individuals from other European countries has been pervasive, even in the most progressive and inclusive discourses on Brexit and citizens' rights. And yes, I'm including many pro-European campaign groups in that as well. And one thing we need to understand is that, as Valerie said, the European identity is not just one. There is a diverse European identity. So I'll give you an example. I'm of Somali origin. I know many Somalis and other Muslims were born in European countries, grew up in European countries, and have come over here, but still retain their identity from Denmark or Holland or other places. And what's quite interesting is that there's this intersection of identities. So, or what I unfortunately have phrased as the triple whammy, because many people can be Black and Muslim and then European. And as we can all agree, all of these identities are currently under very profound attack. The Black community, the Muslim community, and being from, a European country. But then one thing that also compounds that is that imagine you're a woman. And I say that